Well, between last Sabbath and now, we've had a time change. Maybe some of us lost a little sleep. We got a little more rain. It's raining right now, it looks like. And our nation selected a new set of leaders. And there's a lot of people who have different thoughts and feelings about the outcome of this past week. There are some who are very happy. In fact, Wall Street has just spiked with a great surge in the stock market. And there are some who are ambivalent, who have mixed thoughts over the whole thing, not sure what to think or what will come. And then there are others who are so frustrated and disheartened by the outcome of this past week that they're ready to pack their bags and leave this country. And so, as Christians, what should our response to a week like this be? Today, I would like to encourage all of us to pray for our leaders. We can first pray by asking God to help in the selection of our leaders, and we can pray that God guides our leaders. So these are the 2 points that I'd like to talk about today. Pray for God's selection and pray for God's guidance. Many years ago, the elders of Israel, they came to Samuel with a request. Samuel's sons he had set up as judges, but they perverted justice, taking bribes. And so the elders, they wanted to set up a king instead. And so they requested Samuel set up a king in place of him. And Samuel warned them, saying, well, if you put a king in place, this is what the king will do. He will tax you. He will take your young men and put them into his army. He will take your young women and put them in service of his household. He will take the best produce of your land. These are the things that a king will do. Do you want a king? And the elders, they said, yes, we would like a king like all of the other nations around us. And so Samuel went to God and prayed about it with their request. And God said, Samuel, do not worry about it. They have not rejected you. They have rejected me. Go and anoint Saul as king over Israel. And so Samuel anointed Saul as king, and everyone who saw Saul was very impressed. Saul was a very handsome-looking man, and he stood a full head and shoulders above everyone else. He looked very kingly. And so Israel was happy to finally have a king reigning over them. But in the course of time, Saul became all of those things that Samuel warned them, taxing them and taking men for military service. And Saul became so preoccupied with being a king that he forgot to follow the commands of God. And eventually God rejected Saul as king and instructed Samuel to go anoint Saul's predecessor. And so Samuel went to the sons of Jesse, and Jesse brought his sons before Samuel, and Samuel looked at Eliab and thought, wow, this man, he looks very kingly. Surely this is the one that God will set up next. And God told Samuel, saying, do not look at his appearance or at his physical stature, because I have refused him. For the Lord does not see as man sees. For man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. That is 1 Samuel 16 and verse 7. And so Samuel asked Jesse, is there not another son? And Jesse said, oh, well, there's David. He's out in the field tending the sheep. And David's own father didn't even consider him to be kingly. His own father didn't even consider him worth bringing forward to Samuel, but this is who God chose. And so Samuel anointed David as king over Israel, and yet he didn't become king that day. In fact, Samuel had to serve for many years under the authority of Saul, even becoming one of Saul's servants, lead in Saul's army. And so David served Saul for many years until he grew in favor with the people, and Saul became envious of him. And David had to flee for his life as he was persecuted by Saul. And on a number of occasions, David had the chance to free himself of this persecution. He could have killed Saul, and yet he told his men on more than one occasion, he said, "The Lord forbid that I do such a thing to my master and the Lord's anointed, to stretch out my hand against him, seeing he is the anointed of the Lord." But so was David. David was the anointed of the Lord too, and he might have thought he was rightfully king as well. But David respected this position. He respected Saul, even though he was persecuted by Saul, and he could have rid himself of this persecution, but instead he respected Saul. And in it, his people admired David and the example he set, and eventually David did become king, and those who followed him had a fierce loyalty to him. So in the examples of David and Saul, we can see that we might want a certain type of leader, but we might not recognize what kind of leader we need. We might ask God for something specific instead of saying, "God, let your will be done." But God sees a bigger picture than we see, and he understands what kind of leadership we need. And sometimes we need a leader like Saul or a leader like David to help teach us. And so God sees more than what we could ever imagine. And so are we willing to humbly put the selection of leaders into his hands? And are we willing to respect God's choice, just as David respected Saul as God's anointed? It can be tough, but when God places a leader in a position, we have a choice, which brings us to point number 2. Will we pray for these leaders? In the epistle to Timothy, Paul wrote in 1 Timothy 2 and verse 1, he said to Timothy, "Therefore I exhort, first of all, that supplications, prayers, intercessions, and giving of thanks be made for all men, for kings and all who are in authority." And he said, I exhort you to give thanks for all men. And that's easy for the people that we like. But he said, I'm exhorting you to give thanks for all men, and to pray for all those in authority. And these words, they had significance at the time, because at the time that Paul wrote this to Timothy, the Emperor Nero was beginning to persecute the Christians. And in a few short years, Nero would burn down Rome and blame the Christians and kill them in spite. And so when Paul is saying these things, he is really meaning them. Give thanks to all men and pray for them. And why? He goes on to say in verse 2 of 1 Timothy 2, that we may lead a quiet and peaceable life in all godliness and reverence. And this isn't the first time that one of God's servants and religious leaders has instructed his people to do this. In fact, in the Old Testament, there was a time when God gave Nebuchadnezzar power over the Jewish people. And Nebuchadnezzar, he destroyed Jerusalem, burning it to the ground and taking them captivity. And God inspired the prophet Jeremiah to write in Jeremiah chapter 29 and verse 7, Jeremiah 29:7, "And seek the peace of the city where I have caused you to be carried away captive, and pray to the Lord for it, for in its peace you will have peace." And so when we think about the leadership, those who have control over certain aspects of our life, if we pray for their peace, it means our peace as well. For example, consider some of you might be renting. And how do you pray for your landlord at times? Because if your landlord were to suddenly go into financial trouble, well, maybe your landlord would have to raise rent to make ends meet. Or maybe they just can't afford to make important repairs to the place where you're living, and you have to live with a place that's falling apart. And maybe it gets so bad that your landlord just has to foreclose and you have to move. And so their peace means your peace. And at a bigger scale, our leadership, they can make decisions that impact our lives, making decisions like whether to go to war or whether to try to strike a deal or make peace with the nations around us. And if we are praying for our leaders, praying for God to guide them and to give them wisdom in the decisions that they make, it makes us have peace as well. In fact, it doesn't matter who is in charge because, well, there's a proverb that says in Proverbs chapter 21 and verse 1, "The king's heart is in the hand of the Lord. Like the rivers of water, he turns it wherever he wishes." And so whether our leadership is good leadership or bad leadership, God still has the power to sway them one way or another, just as he swayed Cyrus, the king of the Medes and the Persians, to allow the Jews to go back and rebuild the temple. God can sway the course of human events. And so it is important for us to remember this and to pray that God does so and that God guides our leadership. And so as I close out here today, I'd like to say a prayer request. Sometimes we say prayer requests for those who are sick or in need of healing, but today I'd like a prayer request for our leadership. I'd like to say a prayer request for our current president, Joe Biden, and Vice President Kamala Harris. I ask that we'd all pray that they would be able to finish up their term in leadership smoothly and to transition smoothly. And I ask a prayer for our President-elect Donald Trump and J.D. Vance, that they might prepare to take the position of leadership for our country. And I pray for our current governor, Jay Inslee, and for the governor-elect, Bob Ferguson, as he takes office soon in January as well, that they would go through these transitions smoothly. And not only for our civil leaders, but we need to be praying for our church leadership. I ask a prayer request for Rick Shaby and the president of our church and the direction that he is taking the church, and prayers that God would lead him with the Spirit, and prayers also for our chairman, Tim Pebworth, and even our local leadership here. I ask that we'd all pray for Rob Slocum, our pastor, as he leads us. Our leadership needs our prayers. It's a difficult job leading a group of people. It's challenging, all of the decisions to make, but we need to pray for them. Pray for them because it brings about peace. Because when they can hold things together, our lives are more peaceful for it. And I am thankful for all of them, just as Paul said to Timothy, "Be thankful for all men." I am thankful for all of the leaders who take these positions because it is hard. And I don't want to be the president of the United States. So I am thankful for those who do take these positions, and I pray for them. I pray for God to guide them, give them wisdom, and help lead them in the way that would allow us to progress as God's people and as his church, that he would carry out his will on earth as it is in heaven. For to God belong the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. God is sovereign above all, and he has power over all. The more we acknowledge this, the more we find peace.